Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam, Rasulullah, sallallahu alayhi wa salam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the weekly Halaqah. And inshallah ta'ala, we will just continue on to the next slides, please. This week 15 Halaqah is to look briefly at the structure and order in the Quran, and also the Kitab al-Kawn. Some of you might be wondering, what is the Kitab al-Kawn? It's not a natural book, but ulama over the years, past and also present, refer to the Kitab al-Kawn as like a book of nature. Why? Because those are really embedded into understanding Heartsea. And it goes back to the first ayat revealed to the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in the cave of Hira, which was, as we all know, Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. So read in the name of your Rabb. So the question comes in, then how do we read? So for us, in order to read the Quran, we have to learn the Arabic language, and we go through the different levels of the Arabic language. We know how to read Alif Ba Ta. We go through Maktab, Madrasa, depending on what age we are, maybe as a revert, older in the masjid or at an institute. And then we go through Tajweed and how to pronounce the letters correctly. And then if we want to go in deeply, as we should, then we go on to the journey, different journeys, different levels into Nahwa and Sarf, and including a subject that we will cover very briefly in this week's Halaqah. And embedded in the Quran are the profound number, and just about on every page in the Quran, very clear or not so clear, are the ayat in relation to the natural world, to the universal ayat, as in science. So the question is, how do we read those? And the answer, and this is what we're trying to do in Heartsea, or one of the key purposes, aimed objectives, is to teach the Ummah how to read the ayats of the Kitab al-Kawn. In simple English, how to read the language of nature. And we follow the same order, the same process as we would in how we learn to read the Quran. If we just open the Quran, I was going to say, and we didn't know the Arabic language, but sadly we are so disconnected to the Quran that if we just open the Quran, not a translation, the Quran, because we're so disconnected and we don't understand these levels of learning, each surah just looks complete mumble jumble. We have no idea what's going on. And we may go to the translations and we just see words repeating themselves, stories repeating themselves. And we think, okay, well, I learned that in that surah. It's mentioned again in this surah, so I just skip that, which is the completely wrong thing to see. So it's a crisis of perception of how we are seeing the Quran. Likewise, we could be in a forest. I always use the forest as a superb example. There's so many profound lessons in relation to a forest. We could look at a forest from the outside or the inside, and again, it just looks a complete mumble jumble of trees, very confusing, doesn't excite me at all. So we need to step back and learn how to see correctly. And when we say a crisis of perception of how we see the world, generally in Heartsea, we talk about a crisis of perception of the political, the economic, the environmental, the social, because we are seeing the world through a Western worldview, which is left brain hemisphere. And this is a contributing negative factor in how we approach the Quran and the lack of awareness of the Al-Kitab al-Kawn. So this week, we're just going to go in slightly, and inshallah, hopefully it will help. Move on to the next slide. So if we just then look at the natural world, and we look at it is in relation to Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, okay, the command to read, and whether we are looking at the atoms, like here, the molecules, the cells, the tissues, the organ, the body system, then we go into organization, we come round to the right-hand side, we go into population, community, ecosystems, and the biosphere. If we're operating in the left brain hemisphere, we could study all those in isolation. In fact, it doesn't even start actually at the atoms. Now science, which is the study of Aya, study of science, is even going deeper and deeper and smaller and smaller. It doesn't even now start at atoms. But we could look at all of these separately and without moving into the right brain hemisphere, which then connects them all. And that's very important in understanding and being able to read the language of nature. Because the atoms, the molecules, the cells, the tissues, the organ, the body system, the organization, the population, the community, and the ecosystem, but the biosphere, they're all connected. And we could look at the atoms as one complete system, okay, and go into that. We could look at the molecules and the cells as another complete system. So I'd like to look at all of this as an example of the Russian dolls. I should put up a slide actually of a Russian doll example, a Russian doll which has smaller Russian dolls inside, okay, which then goes down to the smaller one. Today we would call that holon, H-O-L-O-N. And in relation to an ecosystem, it could be an atom. Okay, so for example, it could be a forest as a complete ecosystem. That would be the outer Russian doll. And then we break it down into the smaller ecosystems that we find within the forest. Or it could be the body system, okay? And then we explore the endocrine system, the circulation system, the nervous system, etc. Smaller systems, and we can explore those, but what we need to do is then put them all together. Likewise, that's what we need to do when we learn to read and understand the Quran. And likewise, we need to do that in order to be able to read and understand the Kitab al-Kawn. Okay, go on to the next slide. So Nazm of the Quran. So I said to you, when you are learning the Arabic language, in order to be able to read the Quran, and reading the Quran is only part of it. The Quran was not just meant to be read. There is great reward in it. It is meant to be understood. And once understood, it is meant to be implemented. Okay? Because Islam is not a religion, it is a deen, it is a way of life, it's a practical religion. Sadly, because our ulama, the majority, and our maktab and our madrasas and Islamic institutes, because we've been embedded and subjugated to this Western worldview, we are operating in the left brain hemisphere. So all of our Islamic education, which we think is Islamic, is all intertwined into this left brain separated way of seeing things, which is a serious problem. So we have to undo this, okay? So, and one of the key ways is to, as I said to you, when we looked at the picture there of the atoms and the cells, is that all systems like Russian dolls, and we have to then be able to dissect it and then put it back together and look at the complete whole. So when we're learning Arabic, we're learning Alif Ba Ta, we're learning Tajweed, and then we're going through Nahwa itself, which is, looking at the Arabic grammar. And then we we need to then move on to Nazm of the Quran. What is Nazm of the Quran? Remember, when I'm referring to this part, Nazm of the Quran is connecting also to understanding how to read the Kitab al-Kawn, the book of nature, which, remember, is not a literal book. Nazm of the Quran means order. It means an arrangement, okay? It signifies the arrangement of individual parts, which are in the Quran, into a coherent whole. And today, we will call that systems thinking. Okay, so we're perfectly aware of that, and that's how we learned the Quran over 1,400 years ago. It's just now Western civilization has come up with this term, systems thinking. So an example of Nazm is used in relation to stringing beads. You put one bead on a string, and you fit them together, and it produces what? It produces a beautiful necklace. Nazm also signifies the composition of a verse, of an ayat, the composition of a beautiful poem, for example, the composition of a musical piece. Okay, that's a very deep subject that actually connects to resonance, which is a very key lesson that we need to learn in relation to vortexes, resonance, and the composition. Okay, because that's connected to sound. So, my dear brothers and sisters, that everything in creation, the natural world, is in its right place. In the same way, every letter, every word, every surah in the Quran is in its right place. We can see, okay, reference to seeing, we can see and understand this interconnected whole, this interconnection. Remember this interconnection word, okay? Interdependent, working together is a principle, a key principle of nature. So we can see and understand this interconnection and this beneficial web of relationships, which is either throughout the Quran or throughout the natural world, i.e. the Kitab al-Kawn. So we, if we're going to study the Kitab al-Kawn, we need to then understand the study of applied ecology. Remember, I said to you, Islam is not a religion compared to other religions of today. Islam is a way of life. It's a deen. It's a practical religion. The trouble is, because we operate in the left brain hemisphere, we're just focused on a theoretical religion. Okay, it's theory-based. So when we discuss wudu, okay, or we discuss contemplation, we just keep it theory-based. Part C is about, yes, let's learn about it, let's put it into practice. So we need to learn and apply applied ecology. Apply it, okay? And ecology is about relationships. Relative location, okay? Write this down. Relative location. When we are, now let's just look at we're going to go into a permaculture mindset. Permaculture is essential in understanding the Quran, believe it or not, and the Kitab al-Kawn. So when we are designing a garden, a small holding, an off-grid piece of land, there are many elements, okay, to look at. It could be the vegetable beds, it could be a chicken pen, a chicken run, it could be the house that you want to live in, it could be a barn, it could be a pond or a number of ponds, it could be a water butt, okay, it could be a greenhouse that's on the land, apple orchard, pear orchard, farm buildings. So these are elements. So when we are designing, it's not just focusing on what to include and focusing on each one, okay? We need to put them all together. Okay? But we need to step back and connect to, which is the first principle of permaculture, which is observing and interacting. Okay, looking at how, I gave you some example of elements, of how do these different elements not just sit on their own, but how do they connect, in what place on your land, in what order, okay, throughout the seasons, is absolutely essential. So likewise, when we begin to study the structure and the order of the Quran, through Nazm of the Quran, structure, order, and coherence, we need to open a surah, look at an ayat, and see where is each word, what is its relationship, okay, and where are the connections. See how the study of the Quran mimics the study of the Kitab al-Kawn. So write this down. From contents to patterns, from patterns to relationships, from relationships to structures, and from structures to order. That is what we would call ecoliteracy, the language of nature. Kitab al-Kawn. So instead of focusing on what a living system is made of, left brain hemisphere, just looking at the ism, the object, the thing, okay, we need to move into what we call is the half, the connector, nahwa himself. So we need to move from, instead of focusing on what a living system is made of, to study the relationship between the parts of the system, okay? That's very important. Next slide. This is give you an example. This surah, Surah Azab, ayat 24. So we could look at this ayat in the left brain hemisphere and isolate the ayat. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may reward the truthful for their truth and punish the hypocrites. If he wills or accept their repentance, indeed Allah is ever forgiving and merciful. You could open up another translation and it might be slightly different. Okay, you may not even go into any tafsir or anything. You may understand what it means, but very difficult when you're just looking at the ayat in isolation. So what do we need to do? Because as I said to you, sadly, the Ummah today, we're opening up the Quran and we're, even if we can read Arabic, it still may not make any sort of sense. And we may have seen certain ayats very similar to this, perhaps, in other surahs in the Quran. Likewise, when we walk into a forest, there seems a whole jumble mumble of trees. So we need to do a couple of things. We need to step back and we need to focus on tafakkur, another word you need to write down, thinking. And we need to focus on tadabbur, which is another form of thinking, a deeper form of thinking, a connecting form of thinking. And this is tadabbur of the Quran. Likewise, my dear brothers and sisters, we need to use tafakkur and tadabbur of the Quran. Remember that the Kitab al-Kawn is embedded in the Quran. Okay, the Quran, when you open the Quran, okay, Alif Lam Mim, Dhalika al-Kitabu la rayba fihi hudan lil-muttaqin. When you open the Quran, because we've asked for guidance, Allah gives us the guidance. The Quran opens and it's like many worlds that we can undo. It's like an onion. Okay, it has many layers, many worlds, like the Russian doll example. And so tadabbur of the Quran is the same way that we need to be able to study the Kitab al-Kawn, okay? Tadabbur of the natural world. And so we need to step back. So how would we step back using the examples that we've already covered so far? Well, what I would do is to look at this surah and look at it as a complete surah, okay? Don't just study the ayat in isolation. Look at the whole surah. what is the whole surah about? How does the surah begin? Although we're focusing on this ayat for a reason, very simple reason, but important reason. But if we're going to do Nazm of the Quran, the structure, the order, and the coherence, I would look at the beginning of the surah and look at the end of the surah and read some translations of what the whole of that surah means. And then I would just do that in English. Then I would begin to explore then the Arabic, and then I would go into deeper. I would then zoom in, okay, looking at the different parts, the different words, okay, that goes into Nahwa and self, and then expand out. So zoom in, zoom out, then to begin to sort of connect and how each word, okay, fits into the whole picture. So this particular surah really highlights the issue and the anger that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in relation to the disbelievers, more so the hypocrites. And the hypocrites, the hypocrites come up very quickly in Surah Baqarah. Okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins to then highlight after the first ayat, the different groups. And it's not till after the hijrah from Mecca to Yathrib, Medina, that now the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is beginning to engage and see the hypocrites. So Nazm of the Quran, structure, order, and coherence. Every letter, every word, because this is the divine revelation that's come down from the heavens, is every letter, every word is in its precise location, because that's where it is meant to be. Okay. In another way, let's look at the human body. Every bone in my finger, every bone in my hand, every bone in my arm, the ulna and the radius, the elbow, okay, going through to the body, every rib, going into my leg, the femur, okay, into my toes, my spine. Every bone, large bone, small bone, is in its particular place and order for a reason. Okay. Look at the flower, look at the planets, look at any of Allah subhanahu's creation. It is perfectly formed in perfect order and harmony. And that connects to the universal laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, connects to the principles of nature. So let's just explore them just quickly when we talk about the structure and the order. So we've stood back and we realize that this surah is fundamentally focused on the hypocrites. Okay. Now, let's just zoom in, because here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through this nazm of the Quran, see how in the first line, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name, Allahu Sadiqeen. See how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name is next to the truthful. This relationship. This relationship. Remember, it's about relationships. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name is not next to the hypocrites. And so you won't see this unless you explore and go down the ilm of Nahwa and self and the Arabic, and to be able to see everything as a complete whole and zoom in, zoom out. Relationships, patterns, context, structure, coherence, order. Whether we're looking at the Quran, whether we're looking at the Kitab al-Kawn. Okay. So we can see here that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put his name right next to the truthful. There's a very close relationship. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is very happy here. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not put his name next to the hypocrites. SubhanAllah. Look at the last part. Inna Allah kana ghafurur rahim. And again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts his name against his forgiving and merciful. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we understand from the surah, it's structured, covers a number of topics this about the hypocrites. How Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins the surah, okay, about those, and even the ayats before ayat 24, about those of the companions who were strong in their iman, that they didn't waver at all. And look at the last ayat of this, how Allah then returns back to the hypocrites. Okay, so it's like we're delving into the surah, we're delving into the ecosystem. And so here Allah is saying he's very angry and that one doesn't want to have any relationship with the hypocrites. But because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most forgiving and merciful, then there is the opportunity for the hypocrites then to come back. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will then have a relationship with them. Isn't that profound? So that's a beautiful lesson. Just go on to the next slide. And let's translate that into the Kitab al-Kawn. Look at an ecosystem, the structure. So we've looked at the structure of that ayat. Okay. So we've looked at, we can now transfer it into the same way of an ecosystem. The abiotic components, the physical, the chemical, the biotic components. Okay. And then look at the function on the right-hand side. From the structure, which moves across to the food chain, the food web, the flow of the energy, the nutrient cycle. Okay, this is all to do with the language of nature and how to read the language of nature. Whereas if you just look initially at a forest, it just looks a complete mumble jumble. In the same way, let's get an example here for the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence. So in order to understand how to run a society. So what are the rules and regulations? So we go into what we call as fiqh, understanding. Okay, so it's the fiqh of this, the fiqh of this, the fiqh of this, the fiqh of this. Okay, the rulings, what we can do and what we can't do as an individual, within the society, within our business. And so it's the structure so that all connects to understanding the Arabic language. And then once we've understood the Arabic language and we've gone into Nahwa and so, why is that word here? Why is that word here? And connecting to the whole science of the Arabic language, then we can move on to the function. Okay, the function is then the rules and the regulations. In the same way with the Kitab al-Kawn. Next slide. From ego, which explains it more in this slide, ecosystem functions. So the material cycling, the energy flow, and the information flow. So that's your function. So that is, so you've gone from, for example, in the Quran, you've gone from the Arabic language to be able to understand the fiqh, the rulings, then how to operate it, how it's going to be implemented in society, which is equivalent to like your ecosystem services. Okay, so it's corresponding, it's mimicking. I'm trying to explain it in a simple way. Okay, how we break it down and learn the process in the Quran to get the rules and the regulations, and we implement it in society. It's the same way as an ecosystem function. Okay, to then the human welfare and the services that it provides. Okay, how does an Islamic state operate? Okay, for all of humanity, and these, it is the, what we term is the maqasid al-sharia, the objectives of the sharia. Okay, bringing all of this together. Okay. Next slide. And again, let's go back to another example. So when we're looking at an ecosystem, so remember I said to you, everything is in its order, everything is in its place. And so if you looked at, say you went outside and you saw this sort of beautiful scenery with trees and shrubs and flowers, it may look a complete mumble jumble, but unless you go through the process which I'm trying to explain, it will look like a complete mumble jumble. But everything that we see, the tree, the flowers, the plants, everything is in its precise location for a reason. And if you learn about ecosystems, learn about guilds. Guilds is about pairing. For example, you could look at a plant and you could look at, okay, let's just say a plant. A plant is there for a particular reason. Okay, it's growing in a particular location for a reason, but it's there also, it's serving other purposes as well. It has other functions. Remember that word that would just come up in terms of ecosystems? It's serving other functions. So if you were going to design a garden, okay, or your farm plot, wherever you're going to plant, it needs to serve more than one function, which connects to a principle of nature, which is called diversity. And that's why we say nature is the teacher, because the natural world is always in that mizan, okay? One element has a number of functions. So if one element fails, doesn't grow, or something has affected it, then the second thing, the third thing, the fourth thing can then step into place, okay? So we see order, we see balance, we see symmetry, we see a coherent whole, okay? Very important. And by stepping back into the fakku, into the double of the Al-Kitab al-Kawn, like what we were doing in the Quran with that ayat in Surah Azab, then we begin to see it, okay? And the Arabic word that we really do need to focus on is the term zawj. Zawj can mean pairing, it means groups, okay? Groups of flowers, groups of plants, groups of fruit, groups of trees, every color, every pattern, it's all complementary, it's all interwoven. Subhanallah, okay? You can walk through a forest location, you'll see beautiful colors. You can never say one color is out of place, it doesn't fit in with that color. Everything is there, it's meant to be there. So that is how we learn. But we're not understanding it because we are operating in the left brain hemisphere, even in our Islamic knowledge. So it doesn't penetrate the heart at all. Next slide. Placement of words in an ayat. Okay, very important. Knowing why that word is there. So, for example, in Surah Al-Azab, we saw the placement of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name right next to the truthful. Okay, it's done on purpose, as it was revealed to the Prophet. Likewise, the placement of a flower, plant, of a tree that we would see in a natural ecosystem in a forest is there for an exact reason. And so when we are trying to mimic the natural world in order to become self-sufficient, we go off grid, we want to grow our own produce, we need to be able to read the language of nature to be able to mimic design before we grow. Okay, so we're placing that plant, that fruit, that tree, that shrub, okay, that animal, that chicken, that cow in that location because it's meant to be there for a number of functions. Okay, it serves a purpose. Okay, you never see anything in the Quran out of place, so of course you're not going to see anything in the natural world out of place. Next slide. Examples of closeness and distance. Okay, the first ayat is a lesson to the Prophet that what he was looking at is the macro, okay, distance. And then in the second ayat, what the Prophet now is in relation to Allah that it is talking about the embryo. Allah says, Senurihim, I will continue to show the signs in the horizons and within themselves. As we learn to engage with the Quran, we zoom in into a word and we zoom out and we start to piece it all together. That's the systems thinking, that's the nazm of the Quran. Likewise, when we study the Kitab al-Kawn, we zoom in, zoom out, put it all together. Closeness, distance, okay? If we just go closeness, then we just remain in the left brain hemisphere. Our brain hemispheres can't disconnect, they have to work together. So predominantly we have to be in the right brain hemisphere where we connect, but also operate in the left brain hemisphere. For example, a bird is collecting a seed on the ground, it goes close in, it zooms in. At the same time, it's in the left brain hemisphere, but it needs to use the right brain hemisphere to scan for danger, scan for predators. If it just stays in the left brain, then it's dead meat. The predators take it just like that. Same process, same learning process in relation to the Quran. Remember, the Kitab al-Kawn is embedded in the Quran like Russian dolls. Next slide. Now, we saw in Surah Azab how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the truthful, okay? The believers, because Allah puts his name right next to them. But here in Surah Tariq, okay, the whole really lesson here, it's about the disbelievers and Allah and those that go against Allah, those who don't accept Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name is not even mentioned here. So again, that is understanding the arrangement, the pattern, and the order. Okay, we're zooming out or we're zooming in. Okay, so I don't see Allah's name at all. Okay, so the question is why? Okay, because this surah is about those in a state of ghafla, those that are denying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Man, what this surah is telling us, okay, man can get very high, a very high status in this world. With this wealth, it's all there, but they forget their humble beginnings, their humble, dirty beginning of semen, of a dirty fluid. They forget that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is directing these individuals, these disbelievers, okay, to that. And clearly, when Allah in Surah Azab is happy with the believers, Allah mentions his name. But here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not mention his name because he doesn't want to be associated with them. In this surah, خُلِقَ مِن مَّاءٍ دَافِقٍ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by using the word khaliq in the passive tense, my dear brothers and sisters, keeps his name a secret and does not mention himself. Okay, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by not mentioning his name, shows his displeasure at man because they've associated others and they've been forgetful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The second reason is that the person has become forgetful in a state of ghafla, in the same way that they don't even engage with the natural world with the ayah. They're in a state of ghafla. Okay, it just looks like a forest, it's just a bunch of trees. That in this surah, that man has forgotten his humble beginning. It came from semen, from blood. That if it got onto your body, you would want to scrub it off. Subhanallah. Khuliqa. Allah doesn't even want to be shown here, to be seen. deep lessons again by looking at the structure of the whole surah. Okay, order. Okay, should we not be seeing Allah subhanahu's name? Yes, but why? Okay, so we step back and we go into the tafakkur, we go into the tadabbur, and go through all of what we've been covering. So we've done an example there from Surah Azab and Surah Talaq also. And we use the same process in order to study the Kitab al-Kawn. Next slide. Now, that finishes the main part of the Halaqah, and we sent out a quiz, and I put here, looks lovely, doesn't it? And the reason I've put this is this connects very much to what we've been covering today. A normal picture that you would see on a website of a safari, a beautiful lodge in Tanzania, Kenya, Botswana, okay, and it would show you the swimming pool and, you know, sunset. It would show you the drives and amazing scenery of the big five, natural elephant, and your big cats, etc. Looks very beautiful and inviting you to be part of it. But is it real? And how do we approach this? It is about a crisis of perception of how we see the world. How do we see reality? If I took you to this location, I took you to Tanzania, I took you to the Serengeti, and I said, well, you asked me, help me, Mohammed, learn to read the Kitab al-Kawn here at this safari lodge. It would be wrong for me to teach the language of nature here in relation to Nazm of the Quran, structure, order, coherence, because it's not how it should be. It's an illusion. It's not correct. I would not be able to interpret the language of nature correctly. In order to be able to understand the Quran, an ayat, a surah, okay, obviously there's so many things we have to do. We have to be able to learn the Arabic language, okay? So then you have the scholars, you know, the ulama, who are the mufassirin, who go into a tremendous, deep understanding of the Arabic language. We need to connect to the Sunnah. We need to connect to all of the tafsir and the hadith and the seerah of the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we need to go into all of the accounts of the companions, and is this sahih, and all of the whole understanding of Islamic jurisprudence and all these sciences, in order to give us an understanding of a surah. So when we're doing tafakkur, when we're doing tadabbur, we don't even have the qualifications to go into, we're not asking you to go into tafsir. We're going into tafsir to be able to get a better picture, but the tadabbur is compulsory upon the to make tadabbur of the Quran. Okay, how is this ayat, how is this surah affecting me? Okay, to look at a word used in a particular ayat. Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put his name next to that word? Because they are the truthful, so Allah is happy, so there's a relationship. And why did Allah mention the hypocrites, but he didn't mention his name? Of course, Allah doesn't want to put his name. So that's a correct process. But I'm telling you that this is not a real scene. And if I took you to the Serengeti, I took you to the Masai Mara, it's false. Okay. because you're seeing something which is connected to colonization. You're seeing something that is connected to ecological settler colonization. The animals, the landscape is false. It's not real. Subhanallah, alhamdulillah. The majority of what is growing now in these locations has come from outside. Okay, when the white supremacists, when the colonists, mainly from the UK, went into Africa, and it's still taking place now, they decimated in a complete genocide, eradicated everything alive, plants, insects, animals, and they changed the whole landscape completely. They eradicated, they pushed out all of the indigenous people. So I could not read the language of nature how it's supposed to be, because within the Maasai, within Tanzania, Kenya, and all these so-called safari parks are surrounded by gates, surrounded by fences. So the animal world, all of the ecosystems are acting in a unnatural environment. So they are unable to portray their natural behavior. So I could not go down the same process to teach you the Kitab Kawn how I would want to in relation to how we would learn to read the Quran with tadabbur of the Quran. If I went to a location and I wanted to go through the process of the language of nature, I would need to go into history. Isn't that a lesson that we need to do? Does not Allah ask us to go into history to see how previous nations, okay? We go into history. I would need to look at all of the species that are native to that location to understand their true behavior. I need to know why that plant, why that tree is located in that particular position. How do I do that? In the same way when we study the Quran, when the Mufassirin study and they got all this knowledge that we have today available, it is by studying the life of the Prophet, studying the companions, studying all of the hadith. Is it sahih? Is it alif? Whatever, weak? Is it strong? Whatever. Looking at all of this, okay, in order then to give us the tafsir and the breakdown and the fiqh and all of the rulings that we have. And simply, you would go to the Maasai, the individual people, natives, and say, is this how it should be? Okay, is that elephant showing the exact behavior as it should be? And they would categorically say no. Okay, so it's a lie and what they are showing us. And this is what's taking place now across many parts of the world, where we have national parks now. And in these national parks, it's all controlled by colonization. Conservation is no longer true. Okay, conservation has been used as a weapon. And so it is affecting how we see the world. And for those that are in the UK, we could talk about national parks in Scotland. We could talk about national parks in Wales. We could talk about national parks in Exmoor and Dartmoor. And we could talk about the Lake District. I can take the Lake District as a national park and explain to you how it mimics the Masai Mara and how the indigenous have been pushed out and many killed to allow the elite in to have their safari lodges at a high expense in a false environment. And in the same way, you go out of the Lake District National Park and you'll see people starving. You'll see a society in a complete breakdown. It's mimicking it, okay? Because the people behind it, it's one generation after another generation. And that's why it's important when I send these quizzes, what are you looking at? What can you see? A crisis of perception of how we see the world. An illusion. And it's all from Iblees. He just wants us to see everything on the horizontal plane, the dunya. Okay? who's controlling these safari lodges throughout the whole of Africa. It happened in Canada, it happened in America, it happened in Australia, and it's happening today, sadly, in Palestine, Gaza, and it's happening in Africa as I speak to you now. So it would be difficult for me to interpret the signs of a lion, of a hyena, of a plant, of a tree, if I was there today, because it's all out of sync. It's not in harmony. It's an illusion. And that's why we're continually getting the confrontation, for example, between the elephants and local tribes, because their territories, their natural territories, have been taken away from them. And that's what's happened with colonization around the world. And that's where we lost the deep lessons from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in understanding COVID. That was a period when humanity was shut away, okay? And the natural world was able to regain, reestablish territory and their settlements. So a lot of lessons that we've learned today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
barakatuh. Any questions?
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, Sheikh. Is that okay? Can I ask a question?
Please do.
Yeah. So, as individuals and as societies, how can we bring about this balance back? I've read something about Mizan thesis. I don't know whether you've come across it, by Ahmed Paul Keeler. He talks a lot about this imbalance in the society. So as individuals and as small groups of Muslims, people living in the UK, how can we bring about change?
Very good question, and a very easy one, but it requires us to be activists. So whatever street you're in, it requires the individual to understand everything that we're doing today, but to, even the UK, we're in a crisis, and one fundamental thing is we're living in a disconnected society where people are starving. We're supposed to be a so-called first world country. Our neighbors are starving. People are starving. You've got food banks. So what can we do? We all need to become, because we're in the end of times. We're gonna face major problems with food shortages. It's all there. It's very clear that the signs are evident. Breakdown of society. So we need to become self-sufficient. So obviously we have to look after ourselves and our family. How do we do that? Well, start with your back garden. You can develop your back garden, my dear brother, into a food forest. We call it a survival food forest. Okay, if you want to know how, then come back to us. You can establish a food forest into your back garden, and then you begin to invite and share your produce once you've got enough for your family, with your friends and the next door neighbor. If you had one street in your community that was actually producing their own produce, whether it's a food forest or just an area of tomatoes or whatever, at least they're engaging with the land, they're providing for their family, they're having to not rely on ASDA and the corporate elite, which is controlling the food. The food that we're eating today, we've got no idea what it's doing to us. It has no taste. And it's all involving all the marketing. We're being controlled, what we buy. And so we're regaining the power. And then you imagine a whole street that becomes self-sufficient, another street and another street, okay? Then you have a market. You're able to then sell your produce, and then you can establish food banks. That leads you into dawah. where then the wider community is thinking, look what these Muslims are doing. Okay. And so that's what it needs to be done. It needs to be done with the individual to become self-sufficient and to start to learn how to grow their own produce. And then as you develop, you can then develop your own community currency. So you're using a currency to exchange for your products. And then it can go beyond fresh produce. It can go into livestock, and then you bring in skills of different people with different skills and carpentry and so electricians and plumbers, and that's how you really form an independent society which is challenging mainstream. That's what we need to do, inshallah, in my opinion.
Yeah, mashallah. Actually, in fact, I do volunteer for a community farm in Cambridge. So it's a nice, it's an organic community farm where you volunteer and then you can actually harvest the produce yourself, and you just pay 50% of the price, and because there's ongoing costs and stuff involved to cover. So alhamdulillah, yeah. And I was thinking to get the Muslim community involved in this community farm, where they can actually connect with the soil. That's a big problem, isn't it? That we are not connected with the soil.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So jazakallah khair. And just in terms of farming, there's something called regenerative farming. And what's the difference between horticulture, permaculture, and regenerative farming? Is that is it a common thing, or is it differences?
On the whole, they all interlap, but I mean permaculture itself, it's a design process that mimics the natural world.
Okay.
And so that's the slight difference. But yes, I mean, horticulture is all part of it. And so yeah, I mean, as long as you're doing something, but the best way to design your plot of land is to understand permaculture, because that is a design process that is actually mimicking the natural world.
Okay. Jazakallah khair. Yeah. There's a film called 6 Inches of Soil. Have you seen it, or come across?
Yeah.
I'm
just going to explain to you. So when I talk about establishing a food forest, so what is that? What you're doing is you're mimicking a wild, mature forest, and you're implementing that same design system in your back garden. But the only difference is the forest in your back garden, the trees are going to be fruit trees, nut trees.
Right.
And so that's a slight difference, but it's going to mimic the whole structure of how a forest would be.
Okay. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much.
Jazakallah khair, inshallah.
بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والأفضل سالي في كرس إلى الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Alaikum salam.